Hello there and welcome back to the Sleep Science. Tonight, you and I are stepping into something so ordinary you usually ignore it, yet so vast that it rules everything you'll ever do. You're floating in the invisible architecture of time itself. Not the neat digital numbers glowing on your phone, not the calendar that scolds you for missing someone's birthday, but the raw, pulsing thing, measured first and foremost by your own heartbeat. Right now, in the quiet between inhaling and exhaling, you can actually feel the seconds passing in your chest. That's your first clock. It's both ancient and personal, reminding you that long before anyone carved stone circles or wound springs, people sensed time simply by feeling alive. And just to keep you humble, here's a small reality check. You probably won't survive this, meaning not the video, you're fine there, but the whole marathon against time itself. No one ever has. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I'm curious where in the world and in the day you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You sense time first in your body, long before numbers and machines tamed it. Each beat in your chest is roughly 1 second, although cardiologists will remind you it cheats a little, speeding up when you're nervous, slowing down when you drift. Ancient people must have noticed that rhythm too, because long before sundials, they kept time by chant, breath, or pulse. The Egyptians, for instance, measured the work of field hands not with a clock but with how many songs they could sing before resting. It's a strange thought. Your playlist could once have been your paycheck. Historians still argue whether early shamans counted heartbeats deliberately or whether they simply used breath as their first stopwatch. What we do know, around 2000 BCE, some medical papyri already described taking a pulse as a way to measure balance in the body, which suggests people were using flesh and rhythm as markers of passing instants. That's the first architecture of time, your very arteries. Close your eyes for a moment and notice the span between two breaths. That pause is your private hourglass. You don't need gadgets, you're literally born ticking. In fact, a quirky tidbit, medieval doctors sometimes diagnosed illness by comparing the rhythm of a patient's pulse to the rhythm of favorite songs. Imagine lying on a straw mattress while a monk taps your wrist and hums to himself, trying to decide if you're more twinkle, twinkle little star, or row, row, row your boat. But here's the tricky part. Your inner time doesn't match the world's time. A minute spent waiting in line feels longer than a minute spent laughing with a friend. That distortion is older than any smartphone complaint. Aristotle already remarked that time is the number of motion according to the before and after, a fancy way of admitting that it's slippery, measured only in relation to change. When nothing happens, time feels endless. When too much happens, it feels like no time at all. You can picture a cave dweller watching embers glow. His sense of duration isn't fixed. It swells and shrinks with hunger, fear, or drowsiness. You experience the same today when insomnia makes a night stretch like taffy or a Netflix binge, steals 6 hours without asking. Your heartbeat stays honest, but your perception lies. Think of prisoners who scratched tallies into stone walls, desperate to fix time into something solid. Think of monks who chanted psalms, each psalm about the length of an hour. You, meanwhile, might count stoplight changes on a rainy commute, each one a little pulse of frustration. All of these are echoes of the same instinct, tethering time to repeated signals, whether blood, voice, or light. There's also that fringe idea, still floating around wellness blogs, that your heart has a hidden natural beat that syncs with cosmic cycles, like a personal drumline to the universe. Serious scientists roll their eyes at this, but it's true that bodies do entrain to patterns. Circadian rhythms tie your alertness to the sun, and in groups, people's breathing and pulse can unconsciously sync. Picture a crowd swaying to music, their heartbeats lining up like hidden metronomes. It's not astrology, it's just biology trying to keep the rhythm. The funny thing is, despite all the mechanical wizardry that comes later, you never stop using your body as a clock. Joggers pace themselves by heart rate. Doctors diagnose arrhythmias by the same pulse scribbled in ancient manuscripts. And you still know a meeting has gone on too long when your stomach grumbles louder than your boss. Even your smartwatch, that smug rectangle, is ultimately reporting back on the same old data, your beats per minute. So tonight, as you lie there, let yourself listen for it. A quiet lub-dub, the most intimate tick-tock you'll ever know. Somewhere in the distance, other clocks may be chiming, but this one belongs entirely to you. And if you're wondering whether you'll outlast it, well, remember the cheeky truth we started with. You probably won't survive this race against time, but you'll measure it in style, one heartbeat at a time. You follow the beat in your chest out into the open air, where the sky becomes your next clock face. Imagine standing barefoot in a clearing, watching your shadow stretch across the earth like a sundial that forgot to ask for permission. Long before pocket watches or glowing digits on a nightstand, people read time by squinting at shadows. The simplest trick: stick a pole in the ground, wait for the sun, and let geometry do the rest. You'd be surprised how effective it was. Farmers in Mesopotamia could tell when to sow by watching shadows shrink or elongate, and those in Egypt carved sundials as early as 1500 BCE, some portable, about the size of your palm. Think of it as the world's first smartwatch, except you had to stand outside, and clouds were the mortal enemy. But people didn't stop at sticks. They raised entire monuments just to choreograph sunlight. Stonehenge is the celebrity here, its arches and lintels framing solstices like a cosmic calendar invite. Yet it's not alone. Nabta Playa in Egypt and Chaco Canyon in North America also built arrangements that lined up with the heavens. Historians still argue whether these were primarily ritual stages, astronomical observatories, or a prehistoric excuse for really big construction projects. Either way, you can feel the patience behind it, hauling multi-ton stones just so you can predict when summer begins. That's dedication, or maybe boredom at a scale we can't quite imagine. Picture yourself leaning against one of those stones. The air is cool, the ground littered with chalk dust, and the sun, for once, is exactly where the builders expected it to be. It slips through a notch, painting a beam across the ground. That moment is both a clock and a festival, because when the solstice arrives, you don't just know what day it is, you feast. The calendar was edible. More sunlight meant more crops. Time wasn't abstract, it was bread on the table. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Romans were obsessed with sundials but couldn't agree on standard time. In one town, a sundial was installed, only to be calibrated wrong. So people ended up following fictional hours for nearly a century before someone fixed it. Imagine missing a meeting by a month and just shrugging it off. Even today, Rome has an obelisk that doubles as a gigantic gnomon, casting shadows across a marble zodiac. A city still keeping time with a stick 2,000 years later. Of course, sundials had a flaw. They went to bed at sunset. Night posed a problem unless you counted stars. Ancient Babylonian astronomers noticed that certain constellations rose at predictable times of year, so they carved lists of when this star appears, start planting. The sky itself became a library of clocks. You still see traces of that when horoscopes pretend to predict your day. But really, the original idea was simply agricultural scheduling. You feel the weight of it when you stare up now. Those stars look eternal, but they're not fixed. They wobble over centuries. That slow drift, called precession, eventually ruins your star calendar. Historians still argue whether ancient builders accounted for this, or whether they just accepted eventual obsolescence. Either way, the monuments outlived the spreadsheets. Your smartphone will be obsolete in 4 years. Stonehenge has been stubbornly ticking for 4,000. But it wasn't just science. Sundials and stone circles turned time into spectacle. Imagine a festival crowd waiting for the solstice sunrise to pierce a temple doorway. The hush, the intake of breath, and then light floods the chamber. That was a time announcement far more dramatic than a beep on your wrist. Priests became stage managers of the cosmos. If the sun didn't land exactly where it was supposed to, panic followed. Maybe a god was displeased, maybe a ritual was missed. You can sense the collective anxiety, the crowd staring, the high priest sweating. Fast forward and you still feel echoes. Think of New Year's Eve countdowns, ball drops in Times Square, or even waiting for the green light at a crosswalk. These are micro-rituals, shadows of the old stone spectacles, where time is less about accuracy and more about communal drama. Yet here's the joke. Despite all this effort, sundials weren't even consistent. The hour they measured in summer wasn't the same as an hour in winter. Hours stretched and shrank with the seasons. People literally lived on elastic time and they were fine with it. You, meanwhile, panic when your train is 3 minutes late. Who's really freer? Tonight, if you step outside, find your own shadow under a street lamp. You're reenacting an ancient method, except your gnomon is you, and the lamp is humming with electricity stolen from some distant grid. Time keeps circling back, even as it moves forward. So the heartbeat was your private clock, but the sun and stars became humanity's public ones. You carry both inside you. Your chest ticks, the sky sweeps, and somewhere between the two lies the architecture of everything you call a day. You wander away from the stones and shadows, following the flow of water. Because after the sun dips below the horizon, your shadow is useless, and you still need to know how long until dawn. That's where dripping bowls and burning candles step in, the earliest portable timekeepers, each one equal parts clever and fragile. Imagine crouching in a dark chamber where a clay vessel slowly leaks water into another bowl. Each drop is a tick, each rising ripple a step forward. It's not flashy, but it works, at least until someone bumps the table. The Egyptians had one of the first water clocks around 1500 BCE, shaped like a tilted bucket with lines etched on the inside. As the water level fell, you could read the passing hours. Temples used them to schedule rituals, and courts used them to time speeches. There's even a story of Greek orators in Athens being cut off mid-sentence when their water allotment ran out. Ancient debates literally ran on drip feed. Imagine your boss giving you a water clock presentation. Sorry, Karen, your argument's invalid because your bowl ran dry. Yet water had a downside. It froze in winter, evaporated in summer, and splashed when you weren't looking. Historians still argue whether ancient engineers managed to compensate by using clever siphons or just shrugged at the seasonal inaccuracy. What we do know is that water clocks spread everywhere, from Babylon to China to India, each culture tinkering with valves and floats, trying to domesticate the restless liquid. Then came fire. Candles with markings carved into them became the midnight alternative. Burn a stick of wax, watch the flame nibble down to the next notch, and you had a surprisingly reliable hour counter. King Alfred of England supposedly carried wax candles marked in inches to divide his day into prayer, work, and let's be honest, a lot of worrying about Vikings. He even invented little lantern shields to keep the draft from cheating him out of sacred time. That's basically the medieval version of putting your phone in a waterproof case. A quirky tidbit: in China, incense sticks doubled as clocks, notched with metal balls that dropped onto plates as the stick burned. Imagine being woken by a sudden clink in the dead of night, realizing you were scheduled for prayer or patrol. That's the closest antiquity got to a snooze alarm. And yet you feel how strange these devices were. A sundial tied you to the heavens, a cosmic dance of earth and star. A candle timer or water clock, by contrast, pulled time into your hand. It was finite, consumable, and slightly sad. You didn't just watch time pass, you watched your resources literally drain or burn away. Your hours had the smell of smoke and the sound of dripping. Maybe that's why they felt heavier. There's a philosophical weight here. If you're holding a candle that shrinks with each minute, you feel mortality in real time. Historians still argue whether medieval preachers leaned on this symbolism intentionally. Wax and wick as metaphors for the human soul melting toward eternity. Whether planned or not, it stuck. We still use candles at vigils, birthdays, and memorials. Each flame carries the ghost of an old clock. Picture yourself in a monastery cell, stone walls cold to the touch. Your only light a candle hissing quietly. Each mark it devours tells you another prayer cycle has passed. The silence grows heavy, the flame stutters, and you realize you've just felt time itself consume matter. Compare that to staring at a glowing rectangle, waiting for 12:00 to flip to 12:01. One feels like theater, the other bureaucracy. Of course, both methods were flawed. Water spilled, candles sputtered, and neither could keep pace with the sun's grand clockwork. But in those flaws lies something strangely human. You weren't chasing absolute precision, you were chasing rhythm, a way to pace stories, feasts, or prayers. Even now, you light a scented candle and lose track of time on purpose. That's not a glitch, that's the point. So tonight, listen for the drip of an old water clock in your imagination, or watch a candle flicker until the wax collapses. It's the same rhythm that once told kings when to pray and lawyers when to stop arguing. Time was liquid, time was flame, and you held it in your trembling hands. You step out of the candlelit chamber and tilt your face toward the sky again. Because while water and wax could measure hours, they couldn't tame the bigger beast, the year. You don't just need to know when your speech ends. You need to know when the rains come, when to plant, when the herd should move. That's when calendars arrive, born not from gadgets but from watching the heavens. You count time because someone somewhere stared at the sky long enough to notice that the moon, annoyingly, doesn't quite match the sun. The earliest calendars were lunar. Count the cycles of the moon, and you've got a neat 29.5-day rhythm. But string 12 moons together, and you're short of a solar year by about 11 days. That little slippage is enough to throw your harvest into chaos. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian priests fudged their records intentionally, quietly adding intercalary months to keep festivals lined up with the seasons, or whether they just let the confusion ride until farmers complained. Either way, the first spreadsheets were written in stars. The Babylonians left clay tablets showing meticulous lunar charts. Meanwhile, in Mesoamerica, the Maya built an intricate calendar system that tracked not just the solar year, but ritual cycles of 260 days. The overlap of these cycles created a repeating calendar round of 52 years, which sounds like a math problem you'd rather avoid, but worked beautifully for planning ceremonies. The quirky bit. When one cycle ended, they sometimes extinguished every fire in the city, then relit them from a sacred flame. Time reset was not just symbolic, it was smoky and terrifying. Egypt, however, went all in on solar. They noticed that Sirius, the dog star, rose just before the Nile's annual flooding. That became their anchor point. The Egyptian calendar fixed at 365 days, 12 30-day months plus 5 bonus festival days tacked on like a cosmic afterparty. Simple, elegant, and only slightly inaccurate because they ignored leap years. Over centuries, their months drifted through the seasons like lazy clouds. A harvest feast might eventually land in midwinter, and nobody seemed too stressed. Fast forward to Julius Caesar, who finally got fed up. In 46 BCE, he introduced the Julian calendar, standardizing leap years and resetting Rome's messy system. Imagine being a Roman citizen suddenly told, "Congratulations, this year is 445 days long. We're fixing the math." They called it the Year of Confusion. Your birthday party would have been hopelessly awkward. Even that wasn't perfect. By the Middle Ages, the Julian calendar had slipped 10 days out of sync with the solar year. So in 1582, Pope Gregory XIII gave us the Gregorian calendar, the one you use today. Except not everyone adopted it right away. Protestant England refused for nearly 2 centuries, which meant in 1752, they had to delete 11 days from September. People actually rioted, yelling, "Give us back our 11 days." A solid reminder that humans hate when you mess with their time, even if the math checks out. Now pause and notice how every calendar, Babylonian, Mayan, Egyptian, Roman, is basically architecture in disguise. Pyramids aligned to solstices, temples lined with equinox light, whole cities built to channel starlight at key dates. You don't just mark time on paper, you build it into stone. Your own house does the same. That morning shaft of light across your kitchen counter in June, that's your personal solstice marker, courtesy of some architect who probably never thought about it. Here's a fun fringe tidbit. Some researchers argue that the Great Pyramid itself is a giant calendar, with its shafts aligned to Orion and Sirius. Whether it's deliberate or coincidence is still hotly debated. Historians still argue whether the builders had astronomical intentions or just got really lucky with angles. But the thought lingers. What if one of the most iconic monuments on Earth is also a timepiece? And think about how calendars creep into language. You save time, spend days, lose hours. The metaphors are ancient, already in Latin. Time was treated like a commodity, slipping through your fingers like sand. Maybe that's why the hourglass became such a potent symbol. It literally is time draining away, grain by grain. As you drift in thought, picture the sky wheel turning above you, stars circling with slow patience. Somewhere, an ancient priest is scratching notes into clay. Tonight, the moon is fat, harvest in 15 days. Somewhere else, a Mayan astronomer is adjusting a codex, weaving ritual cycles with math that still makes modern programmers sweat. And you, with your phone calendar pinging you about dentist appointments, are living in the inheritance of their obsession. So when you glance at a calendar on your wall, don't see numbers. See centuries of people straining their necks at the heavens, squinting at stars, bargaining with moons, and panicking about drift. The calendar is not just a chart, it's the skeleton of civilization, built out of sky math. You wander now from the wide-open heavens into the echoing chambers of stone cloisters. Here, time is no longer about planting crops or predicting floods. It's about knowing exactly when to pray. Monks didn't just chant whenever the mood struck. Their lives revolved around canonical hours, carved into the day like slices of bread. Dawn, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, 7 intervals, each demanding bells, chants, and inevitably some kind of reliable alarm. That's when the clatter of gears enters the story. The earliest mechanical clocks appeared in Europe during the 13th century, clumsy giants hidden inside monasteries and cathedral towers. They weren't meant for accuracy in minutes and seconds. They were meant to ring bells on time. Imagine a tangle of iron gears and ropes, counterweights dropping slowly, escapements clicking like metallic heartbeats. Each clang from the belfry wasn't just a sound, it was a command. Farmers in the field, children in school, merchants at their stalls, all looked up when the bell tolled. The town's heartbeat was now outsourced to a machine. Historians still argue whether these early clocks were an invention of necessity, monks desperate for prayer alarms, or whether they were more about prestige, giant toys showing off civic wealth. But either way, they changed the architecture of time. Suddenly, hours weren't elastic. They weren't defined by shadows stretching or candles melting. They were chopped into equal segments, like a pie cut by a very stern baker. Here's a quirky tidbit. One of the earliest surviving mechanical clocks, built in 1386 in Salisbury Cathedral, still works. It doesn't even have a dial. It just strikes bells. The point wasn't to show you the time. The point was to tell you when it was time. Imagine a watch today with no face, just a vibrating alarm that barks orders. Honestly, it might sell. You can almost feel the shift in daily rhythm. Before mechanical clocks, villagers lived by natural cues: cockcrows, sunrise, shadows. Afterward, bells intruded, regimenting life. The town square became a theater of punctuality. Time was no longer fluid but chopped into precise, inescapable chunks. You could ignore the sun, but you couldn't ignore a bell echoing across cobblestones. And of course, once humans had gears and escapements, they started tinkering. By the 15th century, clockmakers were adding dials and hands, gilding them with zodiac symbols, even attaching little automaton figures that danced or jousted when the hour struck. Prague's astronomical clock, built in 1410, still parades skeletons, apostles, and celestial spheres for gawking tourists. It's basically medieval tick-tock, short, mesmerizing, slightly creepy, and impossible to ignore. The philosophical undertone is hard to miss. Mechanical clocks didn't just measure hours, they redefined them. If the heartbeat and sundial gave you time as something you felt or saw, the gear-driven clock turned it into something objective, external, and faintly tyrannical. Monks could no longer fudge prayers. Merchants could no longer stall negotiations. Farmers could no longer shrug and say, "It's still daylight, let's work a bit more." The clock told and reality bent. Picture yourself walking a medieval street at dusk, lanterns glowing weakly, when suddenly the tower bell erupts in metallic song. The crowd pauses. You pause. For a moment, the whole town breathes together, bound not by the stars or by hunger, but by machinery. That's the sound of time shifting from divine rhythm to cold iron. Of course, some resisted. A fringe debate still pops up. Did clocks liberate people from chaotic guesswork, or did they enslave them to rigid schedules? Some historians argue that mechanical timekeeping was the very birth of modern discipline, the prototype of the factory whistle, the school bell, the office punch card. Others insist it gave people freedom, allowing coordination over distances and fairness in contracts. The truth probably lies in the middle. Either way, you still live under its spell. Even the language changed. Hours stopped being canonical or seasonal and became mathematical. Minutes and seconds, once philosophical abstractions in Aristotle's writings, were suddenly real, ticked off by machines. Think about that. Before gears, minute was just an idea, like a really tiny bit. After gears, it became a lived unit you could point to. You, right now, live in that legacy, frantically glancing at your phone to see if you're 3 minutes late. Here's a thought experiment. What if clocks had never existed? You'd probably still live by shadows, moons, and bells rung by guesswork. Would life feel freer, or just less efficient? No trains on time, no Zoom meetings, but also no 9-to-5 grind. You might argue you'd be happier. Then again, try convincing your boss that your excuse for missing work is, "My sundial was cloudy." Tonight, as the second hand glides across your digital clock, hear in its motion the echo of iron gears grinding in a 14th century belfry. Feel how monks, merchants, and mayors all surrendered their rhythms to machines. You didn't invent timekeeping. You inherited its architecture, equal, segmented, endlessly ticking. And whether you like it or not, that machinery still rules your hours. You leave the monastery tower behind and slip into a quieter, more intimate room. No bells clanging, no monks marching in rhythm, just a single table, a hearth fire, and a clock small enough to rest beside a loaf of bread. Because in the Renaissance, time escaped the church tower and wandered into homes, workshops, and eventually pockets. The hours were no longer just divine markers, they became personal property. Mechanical clocks began shrinking in the 15th and 16th centuries, thanks to clockmakers who mastered coiled springs. No longer did you need giant weights dropping down tall shafts. A spring could be wound up and gradually unwind, powering gears in a neat, compact case. The results were beautiful: brass dials, ornate hands, sometimes even gilded with cherubs or astrological symbols. You weren't just telling time, you were showing off. If Instagram existed in 1500, people would have been posting humble brags about their brand new domestic clock, captioned "Blessed Timely." With clocks in homes, hours became domesticated. The workday shifted. Merchants could schedule exact meeting times instead of "let's meet after lunch when the sun feels about right." Families could pace meals, chores, and bedtimes with precision instead of guesswork. The rhythm of life narrowed from seasonal and communal to punctual and personal. You could practically hear the tick echoing in kitchens and parlors, stitching together a new sense of order. Historians still argue whether this change was liberating or oppressive. Did personal clocks give people more autonomy, letting them manage their own hours instead of waiting for town bells? Or did it create a new kind of anxiety, making individuals obsess over punctuality? The truth is probably both. You gain control, but also the dread of always being a few minutes late. That dread, by the way, hasn't gone anywhere. A quirky tidbit. In 1577, the Duke of Bavaria issued one of the earliest time discipline rules for his court servants: arrive punctually or face fines. Imagine losing part of your paycheck because your pocket watch was slow. Early capitalism was already sharpening its teeth. But the Renaissance wasn't all seriousness. Clockmakers indulged in wild designs: clocks with automaton birds that sang, clocks with zodiac calendars, clocks shaped like miniature cathedrals. Wealthy patrons loved these little marvels, commissioning them as conversation pieces. One famous example, the Augsburg table clock, packed so much ornament into such a small space that you'd need both hands just to admire all the twirling figurines. Functionally, it told the time. Spiritually, it screamed, "I have money and patience." Meanwhile, portable watches emerged, initially worn as pendants or carried in pouches. They were bulky, often inaccurate, and ticked more like nervous coughs than smooth rhythms. But they let individuals carry time with them, which was revolutionary. Imagine being able to pull out a little case, flip it open, and check the hour on the road. That gesture feels casual now, but then it was nothing short of magic. And with portability came paranoia. Time no longer stayed in the public square. It followed you into private life. The pressure to be on time moved from external to internal. A person could no longer claim ignorance. If you had a watch, you knew. Maybe that's why the 16th century also produced so many grumpy proverbs about wasting hours. You can feel the domesticity of time in Renaissance art too. Paintings began sneaking in hourglasses and clocks as symbols of mortality. A skull, a candle, an hourglass. That classic still life formula was basically a passive-aggressive reminder that your hours were slipping away. Imagine hosting dinner while a painting on your wall constantly whispers, "You're going to die, probably soon." Subtle Daker. The scientific revolution gave clocks another boost. Astronomers needed precision, so innovators like Christian Huygens developed the pendulum clock in 1656, accurate to within a minute a day, mind-blowing for the time. That accuracy trickled down to homes and shops, making punctuality less negotiable than ever. With pendulums swinging in their living rooms, families could coordinate with unprecedented precision. Here's a funny image. Early pendulum clocks were so tall they barely fit in houses. That's how the grandfather clock was born. Essentially a giant furniture piece swallowing your hallway, ticking like a polite but judgmental house guest. People got used to the sound, claiming it even soothed them to sleep. You might call it the Renaissance ASMR track. Picture yourself dozing by the fire in a Renaissance home. The tick-tock keeps steady time while a pendulum sways in the corner, marking each second with solemn grace. Outside, the stars still wheel overhead, seasons still shift. But inside, you've boxed time, domesticated it, and made it serve your routine. It's both comforting and eerie. Time used to belong to the gods. Now it ticks softly by your elbow as you stir the soup. So when you glance at your phone on the nightstand, remember its ancestor, the clunky brass clock that once sat beside a loaf of bread, slowly teaching people how to live by the hour instead of the season. That was the domestication of hours, and you're still its creature. You leave the warm glow of the Renaissance parlor and step onto a soot-streaked platform, where iron wheels screech, steam hisses, and a conductor in a tall hat yells for passengers to board. This is the industrial age, and suddenly it matters very much that you and I agree what time it is. Because if your watch says 10:05 and mine says 10:25 and a train barrels through at 10:15, someone's in trouble. Before railroads, local time was casual. Noon in one town simply meant when the sun is at its highest here. Two towns 20 miles apart might have clocks differing by 10 or 15 minutes, and nobody cared. But when steel tracks connected them, chaos followed. Train companies couldn't schedule departures or arrivals if every station was inventing its own noon. Historians still argue whether the pressure for standardization came more from railway managers or telegraph operators. But either way, the trains forced the issue. The world needed synchronized panic. The solution was time zones. In 1884, delegates met in Washington, D.C. to carve the globe into 24 neat slices, each anchored to Greenwich in London. Suddenly, Greenwich Mean Time became the heartbeat of the planet. The quirky tidbit here, not everyone was thrilled. Some towns resisted, clinging to sun time as a badge of independence. Bristol in England famously had two time systems running simultaneously, railway time and local time, confusing travelers and delighting historians. Imagine standing on that 19th century train platform, pocket watch clutched in your hand. The conductor checks his own watch, telegraphs ahead, and finally waves the flag. The locomotive lurches forward, iron rods hammering, and you feel the collective synchronization in your bones. You're not just boarding a train, you're boarding a clock on wheels. Factories joined the fun, blowing whistles at dawn and dusk to herd workers. Bells once told prayers, now whistles commanded shifts. Life, once elastic, was compressed into shifts, timetables, and deadlines. You probably grumble about your 9-to-5 job, but that rhythm was forged here, in the smoke and soot of industrial cities. There's a curious fringe story from the U.S. Some small towns staged protests when railroad companies stole their local time. Citizens claimed the new standard robbed them of identity, as if their sunsets no longer belonged to them. Even today, you feel echoes of that resentment when daylight saving time steals or returns an hour, and everyone acts personally betrayed. Picture the architecture of synchronization: railway clocks hanging in stations, telegraph lines humming, pocket watches snapping open in unison. Suddenly, everyone everywhere is living inside the same invisible cage of hours. Farmers, factory workers, travelers, soldiers. Time zones stitched them into one giant schedule. Historians still argue whether this was progress or tyranny. On one hand, synchronized time let goods move faster, armies coordinate, science flourish. On the other, it yoked humans more tightly to machines, stripping away local rhythms. Your great-great-grandparents lost the sky's time and gained the railway. Of course, the industrialists weren't entirely cruel. Pocket watches became both status symbols and safety tools. A precise watch could mean the difference between safe passage and collision. Railroads even issued official railroad watches that had to meet strict accuracy standards. A late train wasn't just annoying, it was potentially deadly. And here's the sly modern callback. You still live with this legacy every time your phone pings its GPS. The satellites above you don't just know where you are, they know exactly what time it is, down to the nanosecond. The railway problem never really ended, it just moved upward into space. Close your eyes and hear the hiss of steam, the shriek of whistles, the steady beat of pistons. That rhythm isn't just mechanical, it's temporal. The industrial age rewrote your relationship with time, turning it from a local shadow or private candle into a global contract. You're still signing that contract every morning when you catch a bus, log into work, or wait for a plane to take off exactly at 6:47 a.m. So the next time your train runs late, remember, the whole system was designed to make lateness impossible. And yet, time always finds ways to slip off the rails. You step down from the smoky train platform and glance at your watch, only to discover Einstein standing there, grinning as if he's about to ruin your neat timetable. Because just when humanity thought it had tamed hours with bells, whistles, and time zones, relativity walked in and flipped the table. Time, it turns out, isn't fair. It bends, stretches, and plays favorites depending on where you are and how fast you're moving. Suddenly, the invisible architecture of time wasn't a rigid grid. It was wobbly, like a trampoline under cosmic weight. Einstein's special relativity, 1905, started the mischief. If you're moving close to the speed of light, your clock ticks more slowly than your friend, who stays still. That's not metaphor, it's measurable. The twin paradox captures it. One twin rockets into space at near light speed, comes back, and is younger than the twin who stayed home. Historians still argue whether Einstein intended the thought experiment as a playful illustration or a deep philosophical jab at our intuitions. Either way, it's stuck, and you've probably heard it in every pop science documentary ever. Then came general relativity, 1915, where gravity also warps time. Clocks run slower in stronger gravitational fields. That means your head is aging a fraction faster than your feet right now, simply because it's farther from Earth's center of gravity. Not much, about 90 billionths of a second over your lifetime, but still enough to make you wonder if your shoes are technically younger than your brain. Here's a quirky tidbit. In 1971, scientists actually flew atomic clocks on commercial jets around the world. When they compared them with clocks that stayed on the ground, they found differences of a few hundred nanoseconds, exactly as Einstein predicted. Air travel literally aged those clocks differently. Your last vacation probably added a tiny wrinkle to your personal timeline too. Thanks, physics. But the real kicker is GPS. Those satellites orbiting above you carry atomic clocks, and their time ticks differently than clocks on Earth because of both special relativity. They're moving fast, and general relativity. They're farther from Earth's gravity. Engineers have to constantly correct for the offset, about 38 microseconds per day, or else your maps would drift by kilometers within hours. Next time your phone smoothly guides you to the nearest coffee shop, you can thank relativity for keeping you caffeinated. Still, relativity didn't just break clocks, it broke philosophy. Before Einstein, Newton's time was absolute, flowing equally for everyone, like a universal river. After Einstein, time became personal, tied to perspective, like different paths winding through a flexible landscape. Historians still argue whether this discovery was inevitable, given experimental evidence, or whether it took Einstein's peculiar imagination to rip the veil. Either way, the river of time turned out to be more like a messy family of streams. Picture yourself standing under a starlit sky. You lift a flashlight, shine it, and no matter how fast you run, the beam races away at the same speed. That stubborn fact, the constancy of light, forces the universe to juggle space and time to keep its books balanced. The result? Time dilates, space contracts, and your intuition throws up its hands in despair. There's a fringe idea floating around physics circles. Some claim that if time bends, maybe it can loop. Wormholes close time-like curves, the possibility of traveling to your own past. It all bubbles out of Einstein's equations, even if most physicists mutter, "Don't hold your breath." Still, the math tantalizes. You probably won't survive this here, that cheeky reminder again, if you try to build a time machine, but the possibility keeps sci-fi writers gainfully employed. And think of how culture absorbed relativity. The early 20th century was already chaotic: world wars, industrial upheaval shifting morals. Suddenly, the universe itself joined the rebellion, declaring that not even time was solid. Painters like Salvador Dali melted clocks into surreal puddles, philosophers questioned the meaning of simultaneity, and regular folks just shook their heads, muttering, "Does this mean I can skip Monday if I go fast enough?" You can almost feel the unease. Imagine a 19th century railway conductor, proud of his synchronized timetables, suddenly learning that two trains in different places may actually disagree on what now means. His whistle, once a symbol of order, now feels like a toy. Relativity humbled not just physics but human arrogance about precision. Tonight, as you listen to the hum of your fan, remember that time here is not the same as time at the top of a mountain, or on a plane, or near a black hole. The architecture of time is elastic, and you're living inside its stretch. Each second you experience is personal, tailored to your speed and your gravity, like a bespoke suit stitched by the cosmos itself. So glance at your clock again. It's ticking, yes, but only for you. Elsewhere, for someone else, it ticks differently. And somehow, all those mismatched beats still compose a universe. You leave Einstein smiling smugly in the background and drift forward into a sterile, humming laboratory. Fluorescent lights glare overhead, wires snake across the floor, and on a metal table sits humanity's most arrogant attempt to bully the universe into submission: the atomic clock. No more sundials, dripping bowls, or pendulums swaying politely. This is timekeeping on the level of atoms vibrating billions of times per second, so precise that if it ran since the birth of the universe, it would be off by less than a second today. That's absurd, and also why your GPS hasn't steered you into a river yet. Atomic clocks work by exploiting a simple truth: atoms are predictable divas. Take cesium-133, for example. When you zap it with microwaves, it resonates at exactly 9,192,631,770 cycles per second. That number, yes, all 9 billion of it, is the official definition of a second. Not the swing of a pendulum, not the beat of a heart, but the time it takes cesium to shimmy a specific number of times. You probably didn't know your day was calibrated by atomic choreography, but here you are, dancing to it anyway. Here's a quirky tidbit. The very first cesium clock, built in 1955, was accurate to within 1 second in 300 years. At the time, scientists were giddy, as if they just unlocked time's cheat code. Today's optical lattice clocks laugh at that old clunker, promising to be off by only 1 second in 30 billion years. Which means, yes, they'll still be smugly correct long after the sun swallows Earth. Talk about commitment. Of course, with that kind of precision comes paranoia. Air traffic control, financial markets, military systems, even the internet itself, all depend on synchronized atomic time. Miss a nanosecond and your stock trade might fail, your email might vanish, or your Uber might show up in the wrong century. Historians still argue whether we've become too dependent on atomic time, building an entire civilization on fragile ticking atoms that, if disrupted, could throw the modern world into chaos. But the utility is undeniable. Those satellites circling above, the ones guiding you to your favorite coffee shop, carry cesium and rubidium clocks that must constantly adjust for relativity. Without their corrections, your map would drift by about 10 kilometers a day. Imagine trying to meet a friend at a cafe only to end up in the middle of a lake. Precision saves you from soggy coffee dates. There's also an eerie beauty to it. Atomic clocks let scientists measure phenomena once unimaginable: continental drift, gravitational shifts, even the slowing heartbeat of the planet itself. In Japan, ultra-precise clocks can detect the tiny warping of Earth's crust before an earthquake. Timekeeping has become geology's new seismograph. That's a level of utility your candle clock could never dream of. Yet, for all their rigor, atomic clocks whisper strange questions. If time can be defined so tightly, is it really a physical entity, or just a human measurement plastered onto vibration? Philosophers and physicists alike wrestle with this. Historians still argue whether defining the second in terms of cesium was a stroke of genius or just an elegant patch on an unsolvable mystery. After all, no matter how precise your clock, you're still measuring something slippery. And let's not forget the fringe theories. Some researchers speculate that by pushing time measurement ever finer, we might stumble upon evidence that time itself isn't smooth but granular, quantized at unimaginably small scales. Imagine zooming into a second and finding it made of tiny time pixels, like the universe's secret digital code. Your atomic clock might one day reveal the pixelation of reality. Picture yourself standing beside one of these machines, a boxy, unassuming container humming quietly, guarded like treasure. No glowing hands, no dramatic chimes, just cold circuitry holding the pulse of the universe hostage. A scientist checks a monitor, sees numbers marching in perfect rhythm and smiles. It's oddly anticlimactic, like staring at a toaster that secretly controls the world. And yet you live under its rule. Every text message, every online order, every plane flight, every Happy New Year countdown, all tick in sync with atoms vibrating invisibly far away. You've outsourced your heartbeat and your shadow to a machine that never blinks. So when you next glance at your phone's clock, remember, behind that neat digital glow are atoms dancing billions of times per second, anchoring your hours to the cosmos with terrifying precision. The invisible architecture of time has never been sharper or more fragile. You step away from the humming cesium vaults and into a softer, warmer architecture, the one built inside your body. Because while satellites and atomic clocks run the global schedule, you're still ruled by messier, older timekeepers. The clocks in your brain, your skin, your gut, even your liver. Each organ marches to its own rhythm, and half the time they don't agree. That's why you can feel jet-lagged in your own house if you binge Netflix until 3 a.m. At the center of it all is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, two clusters of neurons in your hypothalamus, each the size of a grain of rice. Tiny but bossy. They respond to light entering your eyes and set your circadian rhythm, that 24-hour-ish cycle controlling sleep, hunger, mood, and even hormone release. Right now, if you dimmed your lights, melatonin would begin dripping into your bloodstream like a nighttime potion, nudging you toward bed. No cesium vibrations needed, just biology humming along. But here's the twist. Every tissue in your body has its own local clock. Your liver has one. Your skin has one. Even your fat cells seem to keep time. Historians still argue whether these decentralized clocks evolved for efficiency or just emerged as evolutionary leftovers. Either way, your body is basically a committee of timekeepers, and anyone who's worked in an office knows committees are messy. A quirky tidbit: if you isolate human cells in a dish, they keep ticking for days, cycling gene activity as if they're still in the body. No light, no brain signals, just raw molecular rhythm. It's like each cell carries a little wristwatch, stubbornly ticking whether you want it to or not. You feel these rhythms constantly. Wake up too early and your gut hasn't opened the breakfast shift yet. Eat too late at night and your digestive enzymes mutiny, leaving you with heartburn and regret. Pull an all-nighter and your immune system sulks, making you more likely to catch a cold. The invisible architecture of time isn't just cosmic, it's biological, stitched into every molecule of you. But biology isn't flawless. Think of shift workers, nurses, or night shift security guards. Their circadian rhythms get yanked out of sync, forcing them to eat, sleep, and work against their body's natural cues. Studies show higher risks of heart disease, obesity, even cancer. That's the cost of living off clock. And yet society runs on it. 24/7 supermarkets, midnight flights, graveyard shifts. Progress comes with bleary eyes and extra coffee. Philosophers once thought the soul separated humans from animals, but really, it might be time. Birds migrate using internal clocks attuned to daylight. Flowers open and close with the sun. Even bacteria follow circadian rhythms. You're just another creature in the cosmic timetable, even if you wear a wristwatch to pretend otherwise. And of course, biology can be hacked. Bright light therapy resets circadian clocks for insomnia. Melatonin pills nudge travelers toward local night. Jet lag apps tell you when to eat, nap, or even stare into a lamp. You might laugh, but astronauts on the International Space Station deal with 16 sunrises a day. Without artificial scheduling, their bodies would unravel. Imagine trying to sleep while your window insists it's morning again every 90 minutes. Here's a fringe fact. Some researchers believe the gut microbiome, the bacteria inside you, also keeps time. They shift in composition across the day, possibly influencing digestion, mood, and even immune function. So when you pull a midnight snack, you're not just arguing with your stomach, you're arguing with trillions of microbes who were planning to clock out early. Picture yourself lying in bed at 2 a.m. scrolling your phone. Your suprachiasmatic nucleus is confused, your liver is grumpy, your microbes are staging a strike, and your melatonin drip has been sabotaged by blue light. No wonder you feel wrecked the next day. Your whole body is in temporal civil war. Historians still argue whether humans in pre-industrial societies lived more in sync with natural rhythms. Did people sleep better when nights were dark and mornings followed roosters instead of alarm clocks? Or were they equally restless, plagued by segmented sleep and midnight wanderings? Diaries from the 17th century describe first sleep and second sleep, suggesting people often woke for an hour in the night before dozing off again. Maybe you're not broken after all. Maybe you're just medieval. So tonight, as your heart beats in rhythm, as melatonin drips, as cells keep time in the dark, remember, there's a whole orchestra inside you, each section with its own tempo. Sometimes they harmonize, sometimes they clash, but together they build the invisible symphony of your biological time. You slip out of your body's humming symphony of cells and clocks and find yourself in another kind of time architecture, the built environment. Because the moment you walk into a hospital, an airport, or even a waiting room with stale magazines, you realize something. Time isn't just counted, it's designed. Architects and managers know how to stretch or shrink your perception, turning hours into minutes or minutes into eternities. Welcome to the architecture of waiting. Hospitals are masters of this game. The corridors are long, the lights too bright, the chairs hard. You check your watch, convinced half an hour has passed, only to discover it's been 6 minutes. The trick? Remove cues that give you a sense of progression. No clocks on the wall, no windows with moving sunlight. You sit in a timeless limbo, anxious but disoriented. Historians still argue whether this is intentional, engineered to keep patients pliant, or just bureaucratic indifference dressed in linoleum. Either way, hospitals warp time with surgical precision. Airports are sneakier. They know waiting is inevitable, so they lace it with distractions. Shops, food courts, glass walls with views of runways, all designed to eat your hours without you noticing. Next time you buy an overpriced pretzel, remember, you're not shopping, you're anesthetizing time. A quirky tidbit: some airports use slower moving walkways in certain terminals, so travelers subconsciously spend more time near duty-free shops. Time dilation by escalator, capitalism at its finest. Then there's the humble elevator. Early skyscraper elevators had mirrors installed inside, not just for vanity, but to make waiting feel shorter. Watching yourself adjust your hair distracted you from the crawl of seconds. You still see mirrors in modern elevators for the same reason. Architects literally bent time perception with a reflective trick. Think also of casinos, the grand illusionists of temporal design. No clocks, no windows, just endless neon glow. Morning or midnight, who knows? The only time you measure is in chips lost or won. It's deliberate, almost theatrical, turning a building into a time vacuum where your circadian rhythms go to die. But waiting isn't always cruel. Consider a Japanese tea house, where the architecture slows you down intentionally. Low doorways force you to bow, gardens with winding paths delay your entry, and the ritual itself unfolds with slow, careful gestures. Time stretches here not to frustrate but to calm, reminding you that patience can be a kind of luxury. Historians still argue whether modern architecture, open-plan offices, shopping malls, fast food restaurants, deliberately manipulates our perception of time, or whether the effect is just an accidental byproduct of design. Either way, you know the feeling. Hours evaporate in a mall, crawl in a waiting room, and dissolve in a dim cafe with soft music. The walls are doing half the work. Here's a fringe tidbit. Psychologists once tested how color affects time perception. People in red-painted rooms felt minutes lasted longer than those in blue rooms. The same clock ticked, but your brain bent around the environment. So the next time your boss paints the office a cheery shade of crimson, brace yourself for eternal Mondays. Imagine yourself in an airport lounge, slouched in a plastic chair. The announcement board flickers, a baby cries, your phone battery drains. Minutes stretch like taffy. Then suddenly the gate opens, boarding begins, and the whole room snaps back to life. Time wasn't steady. It lurched, slowed, and sprinted depending on your environment. Even digital spaces now mimic this. Think of progress bars on your computer. Some speed up, stall, then jump forward again, engineered not to represent actual progress but to soothe your impatience. You've been tricked into feeling like time is flowing, even when nothing is happening. That's architecture too, psychological scaffolding wrapped in pixels. So next time you find yourself waiting, in a sterile lobby, a humming airport, or a mirrored elevator, notice how space itself is bending your perception. You're not just in a building. You're inside a time machine designed not to transport you across distance, but to reshape how you feel the hours passing. You leave the mirrored elevator and step into the hallways of your own mind, where time doesn't just tick, it builds landscapes. Because memory doesn't store time like a tape recorder, it lays it out like a map. You don't recall last summer as a precise timestamp, you recall it as a place. The smell of sunscreen, the clink of ice in a glass, the way the sun carved shadows across a patio. Time, in your brain, is geography disguised as chronology. Neuroscientists have a term for this: episodic memory. Each memory is tagged not just with facts but with context, where you were, who you were with, what the air felt like. That's why remembering feels like stepping back into a room instead of flipping through a calendar. Historians still argue whether early humans thought of time linearly at all, or whether they mostly saw it as cyclical, linked to places and seasons. Either way, your brain cheats, folding hours into landscapes. A quirky tidbit: taxi drivers in London have been studied for decades because their hippocampus, the brain's navigation hub, literally enlarges from memorizing the city's labyrinthine streets. The same structure also handles temporal memory, which means the same neurons that help you remember where the bakery is also help you remember when you last bought bread. Space and time blur in the brain's cartography. Picture yourself recalling childhood. You don't think, "Ah yes, June 3rd, 2005 at 2:47 p.m. You think, "That time at the park with the ice cream truck." Your brain pins memory to location, then smuggles time along for the ride, which is why returning to a childhood home can unleash floods of forgotten hours. You've unlocked a door in the brain's temporal architecture. But memory isn't honest. It edits, rearranges, sometimes invents. Events that happen years apart can feel adjacent, while last week's Tuesday might already be lost. Psychologists call this temporal binding. Your brain stitches separate events into one coherent timeline, even if the stitches are sloppy. You walk around convinced of a story that never quite happened that way. And then there are the long gaps, waiting rooms of memory, where whole months vanish into a haze. Traumatic events often leave people with warped temporal recall. Days feel stretched into years or compressed into minutes. Historians still argue whether this distortion is evolutionary, perhaps a survival mechanism, slowing perception to give you more reaction time, or just the brain's filing system glitching under pressure. Here's a fringe tidbit. Some psychologists suggest your brain doesn't store time at all, only sequences. That is, it doesn't know when something happened, just what came before what. That would mean your sense of past and future is basically a storyline you're improvising, like a novelist trying to convince herself the chapters are in order. Memory also plays tricks with duration. A boring lecture feels endless while it happens, but later, it shrinks to nothing in recollection. A thrilling vacation feels short in the moment but stretches into rich, sprawling memory afterward. Your brain edits not the actual time, but the remembered time, rewriting your autobiography with bizarre biases. Imagine standing in a museum, looking at a painting you last saw years ago. Instantly, the smell of varnish, the hushed echo of footsteps, the sensation of being younger, it all floods back. For a moment, time collapses. You're both then and now, coexisting in memory's architecture. No clock can measure that moment. Cultures encode this too. Oral traditions often place events in the time of our ancestors, or the time when the rivers changed, anchoring chronology to places and transformations rather than numbers. You do the same when you say, "Back when I lived in that apartment," instead of citing dates. You're always mapping time as landscape, not ledger. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, notice how memories arise. They don't line up in neat rows. They tumble like rooms you've wandered into. Some doors are locked, some wide open, some creak with ghosts. Your life's architecture isn't built of dates but of spaces stitched together, each one storing its own pocket of time. So when you say, "It feels like yesterday," you're not being poetic. You're revealing how your brain cheats, taking time, that slippery thing, and building it into a geography you can actually walk through. You wander now into the softest and strangest architecture of all, the one built when your eyes close. Because in dreams, time loses its manners entirely. Seconds stretch into hours, nights vanish in a blink, and you wake unsure whether you've lived a lifetime or just drifted for 5 minutes. The architecture of sleep is not ruled by clocks, but by your own slippery brain waves, stacking illusions into structures as fragile as smoke. Neuroscientists say most dreams happen during REM sleep, when your brain thrums almost as actively as it does while awake. But the clock inside your dream doesn't keep pace with the one glowing on your nightstand. You can live out whole sagas in a dream, arguing with someone, crossing cities, even growing old, only to wake and find you've been under for a quarter of an hour. Historians still argue whether ancient cultures interpreted this time bending as proof of divine journeys or simply shrugged it off as nighttime weirdness. Either way, you've always known, dreams are terrible at punctuality. Here's a quirky tidbit. In the 1980s, researchers asked lucid dreamers, people who realize they're dreaming, to signal from inside their dreams by moving their eyes in a prearranged pattern. To everyone's shock, the signals worked, and the duration between movements inside the dream matched real-world seconds. It seems time in dreams sometimes flows close to waking time, but not always. Your brain is basically freelancing its clockwork, sometimes faithful, sometimes playful. Think of how often you wake from a nap feeling as if you've been gone for hours, or conversely, wake from a long night certain you barely slept. The mismatch is part of sleep's architecture. NREM sleep, those slower waves, feels timeless, a kind of deep cave where duration evaporates. REM, by contrast, can feel like a film on fast forward, compressing elaborate narratives into absurdly short spans. Cultures have always grappled with this temporal slipperiness. Some Australian Aboriginal traditions describe dream time not as a nightly episode, but as a timeless realm, where ancestors dwell in past, present, and future overlap. It isn't dreaming in the Western sense. It's an eternal architecture, accessible when sleep dissolves your everyday hours. Whether metaphor or metaphysics, it captures the unsettling truth. Your sense of time collapses the moment you dream. Imagine yourself in such a dream now. You're standing on a beach, waves lapping slowly, and then, without transition, you're in a childhood classroom. The shift doesn't jar you, your dream self accepts it. In waking life, you'd call that teleportation. In dreams, it's just Tuesday. Time has become space, and space has become slippery. Historians still argue whether dreams serve a practical evolutionary function, processing memories, rehearsing danger, or whether they're simply a byproduct of neurons firing aimlessly. But either way, their distortion of time is undeniable. You experience expansions and compressions nightly, even if you forget them by morning. There's also the eerie phenomenon of precognitive dreams, people swearing they dreamed events before they happened. Fringe researchers sometimes treat this as evidence of nonlinear time bleeding into sleep. Mainstream science usually chalks it up to coincidence plus selective memory. Still, you can't help but wonder when a déjà vu strikes. Did your brain already write this scene last night? Picture yourself waking at 3 a.m., the edges of a vivid dream still clinging like cobwebs. You glance at the clock and groan. It's only been 2 hours since you fell asleep. Yet inside your skull, you've traveled continents, reconciled with old friends, maybe even lived a whole alternative life. That temporal mismatch leaves you dazed, as if you've been leading two parallel biographies. Dreams also toy with duration in unsettling ways. Nightmares often trap you in slow motion, running from something yet moving through syrup. Pleasant dreams, by contrast, whip by so fast that you beg for more sleep just to linger. You wake clutching fragments, like postcards from a place that laughs at clocks. And then comes that moment of waking. The alarm buzzes, sunlight pierces, and your brain, reluctantly, stitches you back into linear time. You roll over half annoyed, half amused at the absurd play that just unfolded. The architecture collapses, leaving rubble you call dream fragments. Tonight, as you drift off, remember, the seconds you feel may not match the seconds on your clock. In dreams, time is elastic, absurd, and hauntingly beautiful. You might live a year in the span of a breath, or wake, convinced that the whole night passed in an instant. Either way, you've walked through the invisible corridors of dream time, where clocks melt and memory cheats. You stir from the strange corridors of dream time and find yourself back in the waking world, where clocks don't just measure time, they enforce it. Because once the machinery of punctuality became widespread, those in power quickly realized something. Whoever controls the hours controls the people. Time became a weapon, wielded by colonizers, bosses, and bureaucrats. The invisible architecture of time could be used not only to organize but to dominate. Take colonization. When European empires expanded across the globe, they didn't just redraw maps, they imposed calendars and clocks. Local lunar cycles, ritual days, and seasonal rhythms were often dismissed as primitive. In their place came Gregorian calendars and Western time discipline, locking colonized peoples into foreign schedules. Historians still argue whether this was simply administrative efficiency or a deliberate erasure of local culture. Either way, time became a tool of empire. A quirky tidbit. In the 19th century, British administrators in India enforced strict office hours that often clashed with local rhythms of heat and light. Imagine being told to report to a sweltering office at noon, when the traditional pattern was to rest during the hottest hours. Productivity didn't improve much, but resentment simmered. The clock became a symbol of foreign rule. Factories, too, weaponized time. The Industrial Revolution demanded workers who arrived on time, stayed put for long shifts, and obeyed whistles instead of seasons. Before that, farmers followed daylight, artisans followed tasks, and life had wiggle room. In the factory, a minute late meant lost wages, or worse. Some owners even docked pay in increments of 5 minutes, like temporal toll collectors. Imagine yourself at a textile mill in the 1830s. The air is thick with lint, the machines roar, and a wall clock glares down like an overseer. Each tick is a reminder, you're not in charge of your hours. The bell rings and you stop, not because the work is done, but because the clock commands. Schools borrowed the same tactics. Bells rang to start lessons, end lessons, and march children from one activity to the next. Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, argued that this was training for modern discipline, conditioning kids to internalize the clock's authority so they'd fit neatly into factories and offices later. You might chuckle, but you still feel it. The phantom ring of a school bell decades after you've left. Then there's bureaucracy. Governments weaponize time by demanding punctual taxes, court dates, deadlines. Miss them and the penalties piled up. Time became legal tender, a way to punish or reward citizens. Even prison sentences are measured in years, a blunt instrument of temporal control. You don't just lose freedom, you lose chunks of your life, counted out like coins. Here's a fringe tidbit. In 1920s Soviet Russia, authorities briefly experimented with a 5-day workweek, eliminating weekends to maximize productivity. Each worker was assigned a color-coded schedule, meaning families often had different rest days. The result? Chaos. Families couldn't spend time together and machinery broke down from overuse. The experiment collapsed, proving you can weaponize time so hard it backfires. But the legacy lingers. Think of the punch clock in offices, the hourly wage, the strict appointment. Think of how often you feel guilty for wasting time, even when resting. That guilt isn't natural. It's inherited from centuries of time discipline drilled into societies. Picture yourself in an office today, fluorescent lights buzzing, the computer clock glowing in the corner of your screen. You type an email, glance at the time sign. The feeling that your hours belong to someone else. That's history's invisible architecture pressing on your shoulders. Historians still argue whether strict time discipline was the price of progress or simply the tightening of chains. Without it, perhaps trains, factories, and global commerce would never have flourished. With it, countless lives were bent, shortened, or regimented beyond recognition. Both may be true, which is why you still flinch when a deadline looms. So the next time you hear a bell ring, whether in school, at work, or even from a phone reminder, listen carefully. It's not just a chime. It's the echo of centuries where time itself was sharpened into a weapon and pointed squarely at human lives. You step out of the smoke-choked factory floor and into the sleek, buzzing world of glass offices and endless notifications. The clocks here don't just command you with bells and whistles. They whisper in your pocket, glowing every time you glance down. Welcome to the cult of productivity minutes, where time is money, every second begs to be monetized, and leisure is often treated like a moral failing. It wasn't always this way. For most of history, idleness was simply part of life. Long winter nights, lazy afternoons after harvest, naps in the heat of summer. Then capitalism tightened the screws, and suddenly hours became currency. Time is money, Benjamin Franklin declared in 1748, a phrase that still stalks office workers centuries later. Historians still argue whether Franklin meant it literally as financial advice or as a moral creed. But either way, it became gospel. The Industrial Revolution introduced hourly wages, and suddenly minutes could be priced. A factory worker wasn't paid for what they made, but for the time they spent. That shift turned time into a commodity, one you could sell, hoard, waste, or squander. Fast forward to today, and you carry that logic in your pocket, counting productivity apps, timers, and to-do lists like rosary beads of efficiency. A quirky tidbit. In the early 20th century, efficiency expert Frederick Winslow Taylor famously timed workers with a stopwatch, breaking tasks into the smallest motions possible. He believed this scientific management would maximize output. Workers loathed it, of course, but his methods influenced everything from assembly lines to modern time-tracking software. In a sense, your project management app is just Taylor's stopwatch wearing a friendly pastel interface. Now look around you. Every tool in your life, from email to calendar reminders, frames time as something to optimize. You schedule workouts, block focus hours, track sleep, even meditate with timers. The irony of timing relaxation should not be lost on you. Productivity culture has turned life itself into a spreadsheet where every cell must be filled. But there's a shadow to this cult: burnout, anxiety, the constant sense of being behind. Historians still argue whether this anxiety is new or simply a modern form of older complaints about laziness and sin. Medieval monks, after all, fretted about acedia, a spiritual lethargy considered deadly. Today, you just call it procrastination and download another focus app. Different words, same guilt. Consider the open office. Clocks glowing on every screen, managers measuring billable hours, workers tethered to deadlines that multiply faster than they can finish them. You're supposed to move fast, reply instantly, multitask endlessly. The result? You feel like you're always running late, even when you're not. The cult of productivity minutes isn't about keeping time. It's about never letting you forget it. Here's a fringe tidbit. Some companies experimented with tracking keystrokes and mouse movements during remote work, measuring productivity minute by minute. Employees quickly learned to game the system, wiggling their mouse periodically to keep the clock running. It's Taylorism reborn, only now with spyware. Time as surveillance. Picture yourself at your desk, phone buzzing with reminders, inbox filling like a tide you can't escape. You check the time again. It's 3:17. You sigh, type faster, glance back. It's still 3:17. Time itself feels like it's mocking you. That's not the universe. It's the architecture of productivity bending your perception. Minutes stretch when you resent them, vanish when you monetize them. Of course, resistance bubbles up. The slow movement, digital detox retreats, even 4-day workweek experiments, all are attempts to reclaim hours from the cult. But notice how even resistance gets measured. You track your screen-free time, celebrate time well spent, optimize your downtime. Even rebellion gets absorbed into the spreadsheet. Historians still argue whether this obsession will ease or intensify as technology deepens. Will AI liberate you from drudgery, giving back leisure? Or will it simply tighten the clock, squeezing productivity into nanoseconds? The future of time discipline is as uncertain as it is relentless. So tonight, as you check your phone one last time before bed, remember, that glowing number is more than a reminder. It's the mark of a culture that has turned time into a commodity, carved your hours into invoices, and convinced you that every second must be put to work. The cult of productivity minutes hums in your pocket, and you, whether you like it or not, are already a disciple. You slip away from the spreadsheets and buzzing notifications, only to stumble into a pastel-colored kitchen straight out of the 1950s. Chrome appliances gleam, a wall clock with cheerful numbers ticks above the stove, and a housewife in a starched apron smiles at you with rehearsed optimism. Welcome to the future, at least the one people half a century ago were promised. Because time isn't just measured, it's imagined. And the mid-20th century excelled at packaging the future like a brand new toaster. In the post-war years, progress was synonymous with speed. Advertisements promised a future where housework vanished under the march of technology. Dishwashers, microwaves, washing machines, all pitched as time savers. But here's the twist. Studies show these gadgets didn't actually reduce the total time women spent on housework. Expectations just grew. Now the laundry wasn't good enough. It had to be spotless. Dinner wasn't just food, it was a 4-course performance. Historians still argue whether these so-called time-saving devices liberated people, or simply created new standards that consumed more hours. A quirky tidbit: the kitchen of tomorrow, unveiled at the 1959 American National Exhibition in Moscow, featured a push-button meal preparation system. It was supposed to free housewives from drudgery. Instead, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev mocked it during his famous kitchen debate with Richard Nixon, suggesting that all those gadgets were more about showing off than actually helping people. The Cold War, in other words, was partly a battle over who controlled the future of time. And oh, the imagery. Flying cars promised to whisk you to work in minutes. Jetson-style conveyor belts would serve breakfast on command. Even the shape of clocks leaned futuristic, sleek, atomic-themed designs with radiating spikes, as if each kitchen were orbiting in its own solar system. The very furniture screamed, "Your minutes will be modern." But you know the truth. Instead of floating through the future, people got traffic jams, microwaved leftovers, and offices that demanded more hours than ever. The dream of saving time often just meant cramming more tasks into the same 24 hours. Progress didn't give you leisure, it gave you multitasking. Still, those mid-century visions matter. They built a cultural architecture of expectation. We still imagine the future in terms of time saved, speed increased, waiting eliminated. Whether it's faster Wi-Fi, instant delivery, or same-day service, the dream is the same. Technology as a clock thief, stealing wasted minutes and gifting them back. The reality: you usually spend those saved minutes scrolling TikTok. Historians still argue whether this obsession with tomorrow peaked in the 1950s or simply morphed into our current tech culture. Back then, the kitchen was the arena of time battles. Today, it's your phone. Both promise liberation, both demand more attention, and both sneakily keep you tethered to the clock. Here's a fringe tidbit. Futurists once predicted by the year 2000, the average workweek would shrink to 20 hours because machines would do the rest. Instead, many people work longer hours now than their grandparents did. The paradox of progress: the faster we move, the less time we seem to have. Picture yourself sitting in that pastel kitchen, sipping coffee from a checkered mug. The wall clock ticks softly, promising efficiency. A brochure on the counter insists your new dishwasher will free your evenings for leisure. Outside, a sleek concept car whooshes by. You smile, believing it. Yet you know how the story turns out. Your evenings will be filled with PTA meetings, extra office work, and reheating leftovers in the microwave. The promise of saved time always cashes out as filled time. And still, you cling to the dream. The smartwatch tracking your steps, the app promising productivity hacks, the delivery service boasting, arrives in 10 minutes. They're all descendants of that 1950s kitchen clock. The future wasn't chrome counters and push-button meals. It was you, staring at your phone, still waiting for time to be freed. So the next time you hear a company promise to give you back your time, laugh gently. That sales pitch is older than your grandparents' linoleum floor. The future has always been a kitchen, sparkling with promises, humming with gadgets, and quietly reminding you, time is never saved. It only shifts hands. You step out of the pastel kitchen of tomorrow, and suddenly the air grows heavy, the ground solid, the horizon endless. The tick-tock of watches and the beep of timers fade into silence, replaced by rhythms so slow they make centuries look like seconds. Welcome to deep time, the architecture of ages measured not in hours, not even in millennia, but in spans that make human history feel like a nap in the afternoon sun. Geologists coined the term deep time in the 18th and 19th centuries, when they realized Earth wasn't a few thousand years old, as tradition once claimed, but billions. James Hutton, often called the father of geology, stood at Sycamore Point in Scotland in 1788 and saw layers of rock tilting against each other, evidence of cycles of erosion and uplift repeating over unimaginable spans. No vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end, he wrote. Historians still argue whether people of his era truly grasped the enormity, or whether they politely nodded and went back to worrying about next week's rent. A quirky tidbit: Charles Darwin once confessed that thinking about geological time made him physically dizzy, as if his brain couldn't quite stretch to fit the scale. You've probably felt a version of that vertigo staring at a canyon or mountain, knowing you're looking at millions of years carved into stone. Your watch can't measure that. It's like trying to time a glacier with a stopwatch. Imagine yourself standing at the rim of the Grand Canyon. Each stripe of red and gold is a chapter, laid down long before pyramids, long before fire was tamed. Your heartbeat, your lifespan, your entire civilization, all of it compressed into a blink against that layered wall. Time here isn't linear minutes, it's stacked, folded, pressed. It's architectural in the most literal sense. Deep time also hides in the patient pulse of tectonic plates, drifting a few centimeters a year. In a human life, barely noticeable. Over millions of years, continents collide, mountains rise, oceans vanish. Right now, Africa is inching toward Europe. In a couple 100 million years, the Mediterranean may close. You probably won't survive this, there's that cheeky reminder again. But the planet will keep shuffling furniture while you're gone. Fossils also whisper of this slow architecture. Ammonites spiraling in stone, fern leaves fossilized like pressed bookmarks, dinosaur tracks frozen mid-stride. Each one is a time capsule that turns your lifetime into background noise. Historians still argue whether early fossil collectors believed these were once living creatures or simply sports of nature, rocks pretending to be bones. Only later did deep time give them proper context. Here's a fringe tidbit. Some scientists argue we've entered a new epoch, the Anthropocene, where human activity itself, plastic and sediments, nuclear isotopes, skyscrapers, will leave a permanent layer in the geological record. Imagine some far-future geologist, millions of years from now, tapping on a chunk of fossilized concrete and muttering, "Ah yes, the age of shopping malls." But deep time isn't only geology. Think of ice cores from Antarctica, storing 800,000 years of atmosphere in frozen bubbles. Or tree rings, each one a thin slice of weather data. Or coral reefs, growing in rings like calendars of the sea. Nature itself is full of clocks that tick too slowly for you to notice but too faithfully to ignore. And then there's cosmic deep time. The light from distant galaxies you see tonight left millions or billions of years ago. You're not looking at stars as they are, but as they were before humans even existed. The night sky is a museum of fossil light, each twinkle a postcard from an ancient now. Picture yourself lying on the ground, staring up. Above you, light older than your species. Beneath you, rocks older than most continents. You, sandwiched between cosmic time and geological time, a fragile creature measuring minutes while standing in billions of years. It's humbling but also oddly freeing. Your deadlines, your alarms, your buzzing phone, they're absurdly small against the architecture of deep time. So the next time you feel crushed by the ticking of your daily schedule, pause and imagine Hutton at Sycamore Point, Darwin dizzy at the cliffs, glaciers sliding with impossible patience. The architecture of time is not just gears and calendars. It's stone, ice, and stars, holding a rhythm so slow you can only glimpse it, never keep pace. You step away from the canyon walls of deep time and duck into a laboratory humming with lasers, vacuum chambers, and physicists sipping cold coffee at 3 a.m. because after you've stretched your imagination across billions of years, the only direction left is inward, toward the tiniest edges of time. What if time itself isn't smooth, but granular? What if seconds, like sand, are made of invisible grains too small for you to see? Welcome to the realm of quantum clocks and time's granular edge. At the frontier of physics, researchers are building clocks so precise they can measure shifts in time caused by lifting them a single centimeter higher. Gravity bends time, remember, and these devices are sensitive enough to feel it. In 2020, a strontium optical lattice clock demonstrated this trick. Tick slightly differently if moved up or down on a shelf. That's how delicate time becomes at quantum scales. Historians still argue whether this pursuit is about practical applications or pure curiosity, since nobody really needs a wristwatch accurate to the billionth of a second, unless you're plotting spacecraft trajectories or trying to prove the universe has a secret heartbeat. A quirky tidbit: some experiments suggest that time might blur at the Planck scale, an unimaginably tiny fraction of a second, 1043 seconds. Below that, physics as we know it stops making sense. It's like the universe refuses to let you zoom in any further, the same way digital photos pixelate when magnified. Maybe time, too, has pixels. Quantum mechanics complicates things even further. In some interpretations, particles don't evolve through time the way billiard balls roll across a table. They spread across probabilities, only deciding outcomes when observed. Time here isn't a steady march, but a weird dance of maybes. Fringe theorists even argue that time itself might emerge from entanglement, the spooky connection between particles. In this view, without entanglement, there would be no ticking at all, just a timeless soup. Picture yourself holding one of these quantum clocks, a lattice of atoms cooled to near absolute zero, trapped in laser beams, each oscillating in perfect rhythm. The whole contraption fills a lab bench, buzzing quietly with cosmic importance. You lean in, expecting a dramatic hum, but it's silent. The clock's power is invisibility, catching time at its smallest quivers without ever making a sound. And yet, practical uses lurk. Super-precise clocks could map gravitational changes across Earth, detecting underground water or oil reserves, even helping predict volcanic eruptions. They could refine GPS to pinpoint your location within centimeters instead of meters. Imagine never losing your car in a parking garage again. Quantum clocks to the rescue. But there's also unease. If time is granular, what does that mean for continuity? Is your life unfolding in a smooth film reel, or is it a rapid slideshow, frames stitched together so fast you can't notice the flicker? Historians still argue whether ancient philosophers like Zeno, who puzzled over motion with his paradoxes, were, in some strange way, anticipating this granular suspicion of time. Here's a fringe tidbit. Some physicists propose that time might not exist at all at the most fundamental level. Equations like the Wheeler-DeWitt equation describe a universe with no time parameter. If true, time could be a secondary phenomenon, something that emerges only when matter and energy arrange themselves just so. In other words, your clocks aren't measuring a universal flow. They're measuring an illusion your brain needs in order to function. Imagine that for a moment. The second hand ticking on your wall clock, your heart beating in your chest, your phone buzzing with a reminder. They might all be symptoms of an emergent trick, not features of the universe. Time could be less like a river and more like a mirage, shimmering convincingly until you look too closely. And yet, whether granular, emergent, or illusory, time keeps structuring your life. Quantum clocks may one day prove that reality runs on temporal pixels, or that time itself dissolves at fundamental scales. Until then, you keep checking your wrist, counting seconds that may or may not even exist. So tonight, as you listen to the faint hum of your room, imagine the universe ticking below perception. Not gears, not pulses, not stars wheeling above, but atoms quivering, probabilities collapsing, and maybe, just maybe, the hidden pixels of time flickering in silence. You leave the laser-filled lab behind and step into a dimly lit cafe, where philosophers and physicists sit hunched over chipped mugs, arguing in circles. Because once you've chased time from sun shadows to atomic ticks to quantum pixels, an uncomfortable question rises. Is time even real? Or is it just a convenient trick your brain plays to stop you from panicking at the chaos of existence? For centuries, thinkers have wrestled with this. Aristotle defined time as the number of motion according to the before and after. Translation: time isn't a thing in itself, just a way of keeping score on change. Centuries later, Newton clapped back, insisting that time flows absolutely, with or without change. Then Einstein came along, tore up both scripts, and gave us spacetime, where time is woven into geometry, bent by motion and mass. Historians still argue whether this was a final answer, or just the latest draft in humanity's ongoing confusion. A quirky tidbit: the philosopher J.M.E. McTaggart once declared that time is an illusion because our talk of past, present, future is logically contradictory. He called this the unreality of time, and though most people shrugged and ordered another coffee, his essay still gets cited in philosophy classes to torture undergraduates. Meanwhile, physics keeps stirring the pot. Some quantum gravity models, like the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, don't even contain time. Others, like Carlo Rovelli's thermal time hypothesis, suggest time emerges from entropy, the tendency of things to get messier. In that view, there's no universal ticking clock, only the sensation of direction as eggs scramble, stars burn out, and your bedroom gets inexplicably messier even though you swore you just cleaned it. Picture yourself stirring sugar into your coffee. The swirl grows cloudy, dissolves, and never undissolves. That one-way process, that arrow of time, is what convinces you time is real. But is it? Historians still argue whether entropy creates time or whether it's just another way of describing change. Culture reflects the debate too. Some indigenous traditions describe time as cyclical, seasons returning, ancestors recurring, everything looping. Meanwhile, much of Western thought insists on linear progress, a beginning, a middle, an end. Which is right? Maybe both, maybe neither. Maybe time's architecture is flexible enough to wear different shapes depending on where you stand. Here's a fringe tidbit. Certain physicists speculate that consciousness itself might generate the experience of time. Without observers stringing events into sequence, the universe might just be an undifferentiated haze. In this view, your brain isn't just a passenger in time. It's a construction crew, building minutes and hours out of raw perception, which is flattering if a little terrifying. Imagine the cafe around you slowing down. Cups hover midair, conversations pause, steam from your mug curls and freezes. Outside, cars stop mid-street, birds halt in mid-flight. If time isn't real, what's happening here? Nothing moved, you just stopped counting the before and after. The illusion of flow collapsed and you're left with stillness. And yet, even if time is an illusion, it's an incredibly persuasive one. Your body ages, your memories stack, your coffee cools whether you believe in seconds or not. Philosophers may argue over ontology, but you still need to catch the bus. So is time real? Maybe, maybe not. Historians still argue, physicists still argue. You probably argue with your alarm clock every morning. But here's the strange comfort. Whether time is fundamental or emergent, cosmic law or brain trick, you live inside it fully. The architecture might be invisible, even illusory, but it still holds your days together. So tonight, as you sip whatever keeps you awake, consider this. If time is just a story, then you're both author and character. And if time is real, then you're a fleeting spark inside its endless architecture. Either way, the clock on the wall keeps ticking, even if it doesn't exist. You leave the cafe arguments swirling in cigarette smoke and step into a quieter landscape. No clocks on the walls, no calendars on the fridge, no alarms buzzing you out of dreams. Here live the people who have chosen or been forced to exist outside the clock. They remind you that the invisible architecture of time isn't inevitable. It's cultural scaffolding, and sometimes you can step out of it. Consider the Amish, who largely reject electricity and digital timekeeping. Their lives flow with daylight, seasons, and community rhythms. A barn raising doesn't start at 9:00 a.m. sharp. It starts when the sun is good. Meals happen when the work slows, not when a clock commands. Historians still argue whether such communities are truly freer or simply bound by older, less visible forms of discipline. Either way, their rejection of modern hours feels like a rebellion. A quirky tidbit: in some remote Arctic communities, people abandon daily clocks during the months of endless sun or endless night. Why bother when the sky refuses to cooperate? Work, rest, and meals happen as bodies demand, not as watches dictate. It's a rhythm both chaotic and strangely natural. Even in modern society, you find outliers. Artists who work at night because inspiration strikes, not because it's office hours. Off-grid wanderers who track time only by weather and hunger. Retirees who wake without alarms, moving through the day as if time had softened around them. Their architecture is elastic, built from instinct instead of quartz and circuitry. Picture yourself joining them. You wake when your body stirs, not when your phone screams. Breakfast comes when the sun climbs, not at a fixed slot. Afternoon is measured by shadows drifting across the floorboards. Evening is when the fire feels necessary. Hours dissolve into cycles, cycles into seasons. The architecture shifts from rigid scaffolding to flowing river. Historians still argue whether humans were happier before strict time discipline, living in sync with daylight and task-based rhythms. Some evidence suggests pre-industrial villagers often worked in bursts, mixing labor with long rests, naps, or communal gossip. The modern 9 to 5 would have seemed absurd to them. And perhaps, looking at your own exhaustion, it seems absurd to you too. Here's a fringe tidbit. There are people who deliberately live by free-running sleep, ignoring clocks entirely. Their days lengthen or shrink naturally, sometimes 25 hours, sometimes 20. Over weeks, their waking hours rotate around the clock. To them, time isn't a line or a circle, it's a spiral drifting endlessly. But living outside the clock isn't always romantic. Try booking a train without knowing the schedule, or meeting a friend when both of you are running on gut time. Chaos follows quickly. The modern world demands synchrony, which is why most people eventually bow to the clock's quiet tyranny. Yet those who resist offer a reminder: timekeeping is a choice, not a law of nature. Imagine ending your day without checking the time once. No countdown to bedtime, no guilt over lost hours. You let the dark arrive, let the body slow, let sleep come when it will. That gentle surrender is something clocks can't give you. So here at the end of our journey, you stand outside the scaffolding. Time as heartbeat, time as shadow, time as drip, flame, gear, bell, zone, relativity, atom, cell, architecture, memory, dream, weapon, cult, promise, planet, quantum puzzle, philosophical trick. And now, finally, time as absence. The invisible architecture dissolves and you realize, without it, you don't vanish. You simply breathe. Let that be tonight's closing gift. Step, if only in imagination, outside the ticking. Let minutes blur, let hours soften. The universe doesn't care what your clock says. And maybe, just maybe, neither should you. And now, before we part, let's slow everything down. Your body has been traveling through centuries and galaxies, wandering across sundials, pendulums, and atomic ticks, but here at the end, you need only to rest. Picture the pace softening, like waves retreating back into the sea. The gears and bells fall silent. The humming of satellites fades. Even the heartbeat you began with quiets into a steady, soothing lull. You lie down inside this invisible architecture of time, but instead of walls and scaffolding, you feel open sky above you, a calm expanse that stretches without urgency. The stars shine faintly, but you no longer count them. You let them shimmer as they always have, unconcerned with minutes or deadlines. Your breath lengthens, your muscles ease. The pressure of schedules and the buzz of alarms dissolve like mist. You are no longer inside the clock's machinery. You are outside, watching it from a distance, smiling at how small it seems. The truth is, whether time bends, ticks, stretches, or disappears, tonight it belongs to you. You can let it carry you like a quiet river, or let it vanish altogether as you drift toward dreams. So close your eyes. Feel the softness of the bed beneath you, the whisper of air moving gently across your face, maybe the hum of a fan in the corner. These are your companions now, not the clocks. And as you fade, let yourself imagine you've stepped into that timeless space. No beginning, no end, just rest. You don't need to measure it. You don't need to hold it. You only need to surrender. Good night, my friend. Sweet dreams.